Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. I'm Colin Fairley. I'm the Sir Edward Peacock Professor of Political Theory at Queen's University. And this is a series of ongoing videos that I've been making in the last 3 months, dealing with my latest book that is now published with Oxford University Press, titled Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. It represents the last decade of research that I've done on translational gerontology and the ethical and societal implications of aspiring to slow down human aging. Now, Chapter 11 deals with climate geroscience. This and Chapter 12 look at the interplay between healthy aging and climate change. In the first video on this chapter, which I posted already, we covered population aging in a warming world. So in that section, I emphasized that both the world is warming and the world is aging. And we want to look at how translational science can help us redress the health challenges of aging in a warming planet. And we want to avoid communicative frames that presume the issue is one of intergenerational conflict rather than one of intergenerational solidarity. And that's what I'm going to be emphasizing here in this video. So this second video on Chapter 11, I'm going to unpack what I mean by climate geroscience. And in the third video that will follow after this one, I will offer some practical prescriptions for creating greater collaboration within the scientific community so that some of these issues can be redressed and we can have better understanding about why healthy aging is so important to planetary health. The question that really loomed large in my mind as I got to the final stages of research for this book was the question about whether or not it's socially responsible to aspire to develop drugs that will slow human aging. And over the 20 years I've been teaching the ethics of longevity science, I've encountered many different objections and concerns from students, from peer reviewers that were refereeing my journal articles, from interlocutors. When I present in philosophy, it's very different than when I present to a gerontology audience. And so I'm very aware of how the moral landscape is perceived in different ways, depending on one's background, whether or not one's coming at a topic from background debates in academic philosophy, where populations don't even age, and we don't really take seriously the predicament of aging populations, and climate change is looked at in a kind of a vacuum. Or if you come from the field of gerontology, where your main concern is trying to promote the health of older populations, but you may be not so aware of some of the ageist attitudes and sentiments that are very common in ethical debates within philosophy. So I'm trying to work at the intersection of these different audiences to show the common ground, but also to avoid the common tropes that are often amplified in some of the activism for scientists and protesters in various areas of science for and against it. So I refer to this issue of climate change as the elephant in the room for geroscience. And rather than sticking our head in the sand and pretending that the optics of longevity science don't have this problem of talking about how it's going to impact climate change, I instead want to take our head out of the sand and address it head on, and address it in ways that is empirically valid and morally enlightening in terms of seeing how healthy aging will be actually beneficial in many respects for non-human species, but also for planetary health. So in an earlier video, I talked about the scientific enterprise as a moral enterprise, and I described this as aspirational rather than factual, that there's certainly moral components to the scientific enterprise, which of course is not one coherent enterprise. There are many distinct areas of scientific inquiry, but it comes up short, I think, of what our ideals are. When we think about our ideals for science as a moral enterprise, a whole host of moral interests would be identified. So we would want science to promote global health, not simply the health of those living in the richest countries of the world. That has to be global in scope. And throughout this book, I've been emphasizing that aging is a global phenomenon. Right? Lower income countries, middle income countries, and higher income countries are all aging, though how their populations will age will be quite different. And then even within those countries, people will age differently based on a variety of things, ranging from their genetics to their socioeconomic status, to their sex, to their exposure to things that can accelerate the mechanisms of biological aging. There's also, we want the scientific enterprise to abate inequality. We don't want it to exacerbate inequality. We want the scientific enterprise to take seriously planetary health. The moral landscape extends beyond simply the moral interests of humans to non-human animals and to the planet as a whole. And we also want we want science to improve the economic prospects of global populations, and in particular in those regions of the world that are most economically disadvantaged. And finally, we want science to take seriously not only the moral interests of those alive today, but those who will follow us in the future, so that we see it as a project of moral stewardship, that we're not just consuming all of the world's resources to improve our well-being and leaving the future generations to fend for themselves in a severely disadvantaged circumstance as a result of our indulgence on the world's resources. So the philosopher that I rely on for this chapter in particular is Philip Kitcher, along with Maxwell, the two prominent philosophers of science that I utilize throughout the book. And he has a great article in Bioscience titled Responsible Biology, where he articulates this ideal that scientists should think of themselves as artisans working towards the public good, and as such, they ought to reflect upon the ends and not just the means of their biological research. Right, so Kitcher emphasizes that it's important not only to make sure that you're transparent and honest about the data you use for your scientific experiments and when publishing, but to actually look at the broader picture about saying, what is this translational science aspiring to do? And perhaps we shouldn't do it, or perhaps there's something that we could be doing that is actually much more morally defensible than what it is that we're doing. And I'm going to encourage both climate scientists and geroscientists to think of themselves as artisans working towards the public good in an aging, warming world. And that's where the intersection of climate geroscience is looking at the interdependence between human and planetary health. So I want to suggest that actually, while there's very little understanding between these two areas of science at the moment, this is a reflection of the shortcomings of the current scientific enterprise, which has prioritized knowledge inquiry science over wisdom inquiry science, that's prioritized careerist incentives for advancing one's career rather than actually trying to take on the aspiration of improving the well-being of the global population and planetary health more generally. So this is the idea that I have around climate geroscience. So climate science and geroscience at the moment are distinct areas of science. Climate science is the study of the Earth's climate and the biology of aging for geroscience. But I think there's translational science at the intersection of these two things. These come to the fore when we think about mitigation and adaptation strategies. And my advice for climate science is to reduce narratives that perpetuate ageism. That's the big frame that I want to push back against the field, and instead embrace a narrative of intergenerational solidarity. That is actually more factually accurate of the predicaments of climate change, but it also will, I believe, shed light on more promising solutions. But I also have criticism for the geroscientists out there, especially those that talk about radical life extension or immortality or biological immortality being achieved through a pill, as if, what happens to the environment doesn't matter, that some pill will protect us from climate change. We want to abate that type of narrative as well. So I encourage the promotion of an ethos of planetary health stewardship, one that frames healthy aging interdependently with the environment. So we need clean environments. We need planetary health in order for human health to also be optimized. So there are shared goals. That's really what I'm focusing on, improving planetary health and the health of aging populations. And there are many distinct epistemic benefits of an improved understanding and collaboration between these two areas of science. So this book attempts to do many things. It tries to convince philosophers to take an interest in longevity science. It's also trying to communicate to the broader public the societal significance of translational gerontology, but it's also speaking to scientists in these distinct domains of inquiry, that those studying the climate, those studying aging, should learn something about the other's field and see that there's great overlap between them, and so that they actually don't jeopardize the aspirations of the other field, that they're actually working towards the common destination, which is a healthier future for the planet and for human populations. So I'm going to just briefly highlight the three things that I tried to, the threefold diagnosis that I give about the problems of kind of presenting a polarized view between climate science and geroscience. The first, as I mentioned in the first video, is framing climate change as a problem of intergenerational conflict. This is actually just empirically wrong. It's very common in ethics and political philosophy to think this way, right? So you have the haves and the have-nots. You have those that created the problem and those that are stuck with the problem. But the reality of climate change is way more complex and intricate than that. So one of the things that I emphasize is that climate change, the harms of climate change, are actually compounded for those that are of more advanced age, right? There's many studies within gerontology to show that older persons are going to be more vulnerable to the health maladies of a warming planet. So I cite here some from the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry, the impact of climate change on elder health, from the journals of gerontology, elder abuse that occurs during neglect in natural disasters, aging hearts in a hotter, more turbulent world. So as I mentioned in the first video, I had a young student come up to me after one of my classes to say, well, why should we care about the science of healthy aging when his generation is the last generation to live? And part of me wanted to say, well, there's good news and bad news. Like, the good news is you actually will age, and the bad news is that you will age in a warming world. That was a little bit, mean, so I didn't frame it that way for the student, but it's a mistake to see these as distinct things. So climate change is real, and the science of healthy aging is real, and it will be better for everybody if older populations have greater biological resilience to climate change, and we also try to abate the actions that will exacerbate the harms of climate change. So we want to be reducing carbon emissions, but we also want to be adapting our physical environment, but also our biology to be better adapted both to aging in any scenario, but especially aging in a warming world. So this is the first reason it's a mistake to present it as intergenerational conflict. Most of the adverse health effects of climate change will be borne by the poor and older persons, and especially when we take an intersectional lens, this will be women who live longer than men, and especially women living in lower and middle income countries where they will not have access to the same kinds of healthcare benefits that those living in richer countries will enjoy. So we want to avoid the presumption that somehow older persons are not going to be, they're already experiencing the harms of climate change through, severe heat events, natural disasters, etc. But the other reason why the intergenerational conflict narrative is problematic is that it neglects the fact that today's older persons and scientists were those who were advocating for many, many decades to get environmental science on the political radar, right? So I have an image of the first Earth Day in 1970. That's the year I was born. So the people that were advocating for this science some 55 plus years ago are now in their 70s and 80s. And you don't want to say, well, you're the ones that created this problem. They're the ones that got the problem on the radar in the first place. And it's not the kind of problem that can be solved in like a 10-year window. That's not to say there's not legitimacy in saying that we should have been doing more and that we can do more now. But I believe it's unhelpful to fan the flames of ageism by saying that older persons created the problem and are not bearing any of the costs. They actually are part of our being able to identify climate change as a problem, but they are also will be, and the youth of today will be aging, and they will be also aging in a warming world. So that's my attempt to get rid of the first frame that climate change is a problem of intergenerational conflict. Now I want to focus on the green part, framing the goal of carbon net zero as a sacred value. This is a concept from Philip Tetlock. When we think about something as a sacred value, we think of it as an absolute value, that there's no trade-off or compromise that can be made. And this is a very common sentiment that we have when we say something's really important. But of course, everything involves a trade-off, including human health and including planetary health. But the real question is, what constitutes a reasonable trade-off? And this is what the benefit of wisdom inquiry science offers as a theoretical framework. It's pluralistic and draws our attention to reasonable trade-offs. So when we think about the goal of carbon net zero as a sacred value, that implies we do everything we can to try to reduce carbon emissions. I mean, that, of course, is a preposterous proposal. I mean, one thing you could do is just stop feeding the 8 billion plus people in the world. And, as everyone's dead in a couple of months, carbon emissions from humans would go down, but now you'd have the human populations are gone. So we want to pursue carbon net zero in empirically valid and morally defensible ways. We don't want to conceptualize it as a sacred value that everything else is subjected and subordinated to the goal of carbon net zero. So I want to dispense with this presumption as well. Put simply, net zero means cutting carbon emissions to a small amount of residual emissions that can be absorbed or durably stored by nature and other carbon dioxide removal measures, leaving zero in the atmosphere. So that's a morally laudable aspiration, but the means to get there have to be morally defensible and empirically valid. Culling the human population is not a morally defensible way of achieving it, so nobody would propose more wars or accidents or cancer to achieve carbon net zero. And similarly, we shouldn't propose forfeiting geroprotective drugs that will help to delay the onset of disease, frailty, and disability in late life for the sake of reducing carbon emissions. So this tendency, when we think about projections by the year 2100 of 10 or 11 billion people, automatically people's minds go to, well, there goes the goal of carbon net zero. We can't do that if you're extending the duration of life of humans. We've got to get less people and living, not as long. But when you frame it that way, I think you realize that actually part of the reason you're trying to reduce carbon emissions is to avoid human mortality from climate change. But forfeiting public health measures is even worse than forfeiting the potential benefits. It's not a rational strategy to say that you want to promote the health benefits of climate change by forfeiting other public health benefits, right? So we need to be kind of holistic in recognizing that there's a plurality of tools available for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but forfeiting public health measures is not one of them. So we don't pursue the end of carbon net zero via any means, such as forfeiting public health measures that would extend especially healthy lifespans. So the wisdom inquiry longevity science frame that I deploy throughout the book draws our attention to the importance of trade-offs, and I try to avoid treating both the ends of healthy aging and the ends of carbon net zero as sacred values, right? Which takes me to the third frame that I want to dispense with. So I also have criticism for those in the field of geroscience who talk about radical life extension or biological immortality, when the aims of geroscience are framed in such unrealistic terms, it gives the impression that the field lacks an ethos of planetary health stewardship. Right? It simply gives the impression that all we need to develop are drugs that will keep us alive regardless of the state of planetary health. And that's simply false. A pill might help boost our biological resilience to the onset of disease, frailty, and disability, but we also need to continue living healthy lifestyles, consuming healthy diets, and abating the extrinsic health and mortality risks of a warming world. And so by dropping the narratives around radical life extension, I think we can abate the unhelpful communicative frames that amplify the tension or perceived tension between climate science and geroscience. So in this chapter, I also detail 3 examples of how translational gerontology could actually help reduce greenhouse gas emissions for human populations and animal planetary health. The first is to point out that the world's healthcare systems are estimated to contribute about 4.4% of global net carbon emissions. And so as more populations are aging, if the health span lifespan gap continues to grow, then we are going to be expanding the greenhouse gas emissions from the world's healthcare systems. But if we can compress to keep people healthier longer so that they were actually consuming, they won't rely on healthcare systems as much because they're healthier, that will also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So really what you want to compare is the future of only pursuing disease control and its impact on greenhouse gas emissions with slowing human aging compared to its projected effects on greenhouse gas emissions. And I believe the strategy of rate control is much more compatible with the aspirations of mitigation than a strategy of only pursuing disease control, which simply extends the duration of life by delaying mortality, especially the period of life where we're managing multimorbidity and consuming more healthcare resources. Right. A second benefit, I'm only going to briefly mention this, concerns the application of translational gerontology to non-human species. And I'm going to pick 2, first with agricultural animals and then companion pets. So one of the contributors to greenhouse gas emissions is methane. We rely on many animals for human consumption, including cattle. And one of the things to point out about dairy cattle is that there is a disparity between how long a dairy cow can survive, which is about 20 years, producing milk for about 3 or 4 years. So for you spend the first 2 years raising the calf, then they can produce milk for 3 or 4 years, and then they're slaughtered for meat consumption, and then you have to, continue to rear more cattle. But if you could reduce the disparity between the productive lifespan and their lifespan, meaning you could keep cattle producing milk longer as a result of slowing aging, you would need to rear less cattle. So you could eliminate that 2-year window where you're having to provide the feed for cattle, which requires food, which exacerbates the greenhouse gas emissions. So you could reap the same yield of milk by rearing less cattle. So this is just an example where I want to suggest we could use our imagination to see how translational gerontology could be applied in other domains that perhaps we never even thought of, in ways that are beneficial to planetary health. And I think dairy cattle is just one interesting and important example of that. And thirdly, the last example that I use in this chapter is with companion animals. Dogs and cats consume, just as dairy cattle do, energy. In the United States, it's estimated that cats and dogs consume almost as much as energy as 62 million Americans, or about 1/5 of the US population. So aging research reveals two fascinating things, I think, in particular about dogs. So smaller breeds of dogs survive longer, right? So 10 to 15 years versus 8 to 10 years. So one argument you could make, depending on why one pursues pet companionship, but if your needs for pet companionship could be met with a smaller breed, you would be able to have more years of pet companionship with less energy consumption and therefore greenhouse gas emissions. But more interestingly is the development of drugs for companion pets to extend the duration of health span. So if we're able to keep our pets healthy longer, this would mean that we could have more years of pet companionship with less feed. Puppies require more feed than older dogs. And so you get both. It's better for the pet, it's better for the pet owner, and it's also better for the planet. So again, I'm trying to amplify an ethos of planetary health stewardship to encourage geroscientists to think of how the application of translational gerontology could be beneficial for non-human health, animal health, and planetary health more generally. And that will be an issue that I address again in the next chapter, which is chapter 12. Okay, so as we're going to see, I want to make a distinction between the non-ideal scientific enterprise, this is the world in which we live, and then the epistemic ideal of what Philip Kitcher calls responsible biology, and this is the ideal of collaboration between climate science and geroscience. So in this model, we're envisioning scientists working collaboratively together about, what is the desired ends and how best to get there. And behind the red curtain, I have a kind of forensic report on the non-ideal real scientific enterprise. And I'm going to save that because this video has already gone on rather lengthy. I'm going to save that for the third video on chapter 11, when I offer some practical advice about how we could foster greater collaboration. So I'm going to continue on this theme in the third video, which will be the last one on chapter 11, titled Climate Geroscience.